Greetings, you happily miserable accursed. It's Herle here with Teneycke, Leichnitz and Reid, recording on this Remembrance Day, Monday, November 11th, 2024. It's a heavy day, you know? It's a heavy day, Remembrance Day. I can't really get over what people did back in those days, you know? I was at the Leaf game on Saturday night, and they were honoring vets that were there, and these kids volunteered. These kids were like 16, lying about their age. Maybe they were 18, volunteering to go over there and fight that fight for us. I always think about my uncle, Pete Feger, who was the only member of my family who fought. And he was a bombardier. He came back. He led an exemplary life. He was an educator. He raised a great family, all that. But my mother always told me that he went away to war, a happy-go-lucky, fun-loving kid, and came back a very serious, kind of stern person. He'd seen some shit, and he wasn't the same.
Yeah, one of my life is obviously riddled with regrets, but one of them, very seriously, is that in Christmas of 1993, my uncle Stanley Tinker, Uncle Tink, he had been, during the war, he, like you just said, he had volunteered and went into the Royal Canadian Air Force and had never left, hardly left Hastings County. And then all of a sudden he finds himself in Britain, and he's flying missions over Germany, and he gets shot down because everybody in the Air Force, everybody who was in a bomber got shot down. So he spends 3 days running around the woods, gets captured by the Nazis, spends the rest of the war, 23 months in a German prisoner of war camp. And in Christmas 1993, he says to me, I've not been back there. I've not really gone back there. And I want to go back there for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. And I want to visit the camp, and I want to go. And he was going to take me. And then the guy died, in March. So That's a regret.
Yeah. I think my thoughts today also turn, to modern veterans. I think a lot about the folks who were impacted in Afghanistan, people who lost their lives, and people whose lives were just changed irrevocably. And I think that war has so vanished from our public consciousness, but the impact of it really lingers. And I think a lot about them today.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep.
All right. So here's the rundown for today. Last Tuesday, the United States of America made a rather decisive choice. We're going to spend the better part of that show triangulating that with Canada. What changes is that going to bring to Canadian politics? What do we learn about that from Canadian politics? Our cursed clipping is right on point. It's a fantastic opinion piece written by pollster and data scientist Kyla Rennell-Fitch, founder of Relay Strategies, posted the day after the election. 4 early lessons for Canadian progressives. We'll talk about it here, but you should look it up. We're going to talk a little bit about polling and the state of the polling industry after the U.S. election, and then the eternal Mr. Pinson brings it all home with our Hey Yous. All right, Jordan, Scott, Kory, let's get into it. First of all, Scott, I like your shirt. You and I were at a great concert on Friday night, the Jayhawks.
The Jayhawks. I'm sporting the Jayhawks merch.
Yeah.
It was fantastic.
They were good. They were fucking good.
They were really good. And it was a cool, loose concert because, and I didn't know if you knew this, but Gary Lewis, who heads up the Jayhawks, turns out he's got a farm in Caledon. His wife is from Kingston, Ontario. He's got a new song called Kingston Girl. He played that. Like, it was like a heavy-duty dose of Canadian content. And by the way, I was also reading online, Dave, that Lucinda Williams has integrated the song Blue by the Skyhawks, by the Jayhawks, into her set that she's touring on right now. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Awesome. Such a great song. Now, Kory was at one of the major Domo political events of the year in Calgary this weekend. Kory, what was going on?
There was a dinner of former staff and friends and family members of Preston Manning to honor his contribution to Canadian politics and to the lives of all of the aforementioned. It was really nice, like a really great group of people, including our friend and former member of the podcast, Jenny Byrne, who gave some very heartfelt and touching remarks about Preston.
She loves Preston.
She sure does.
Yeah, no, it was a really great group, and some other big names of the conservative world there. Premier Harris made the trip out to talk a little bit about what reform meant for him and the influence on the common sense revolution. And Stephen Harper gave a really nice speech, and their relationship was always a little bit complicated, but boy, does he have a lot of respect for Preston, and for reasons that he really thoughtfully laid out.
Let me guess, though. Slightly less hand-wringing about the U.S. election than you're expecting on this show today.
Yeah, slightly less, but but yeah, it's but not a huge topic of conversation, to be honest. Like I think the focus was as it should have been at that event, really just reflecting on the past. It's also it's not until you're in a room like that that you realize how many relationships we've built up through campaigns and through working in politics. And you kind of lose track of some people, not for intentionally in any way, but everyone goes on and does different things with their lives, and many of them quite remarkable things. And politics was a moment in time, and they've gone on and taken that experience to do all kinds of interesting and meaningful things. But you come back together and you get to relive some of those past experiences. Anyway, it was just a really nice evening.
That is one of the great things about politics. So you and Jenny were on that reform bus. Kids, the youth bus that was barnstorming Ontario in 2000. Have I got that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yep. Yeah. And who else was have you all stayed together? The people on that bus?
Yeah.
All stayed in touch?
Was Ringo on that bus, or was it Pete Best?
Well, I don't think everyone has stayed in touch. Some people have and some haven't. But there are a lot of people who were a part of that who've gone on to have pretty remarkable careers in politics. Jenny being an obvious one, but people like Shuv Majumdar, who's a really great person in caucus, and Ray Novak, who played a huge role as Harper's principal secretary and chief of staff, and just really a great group of folks.
Shuv Majumdar, did I say his name right?
Yep.
He is now the closest Kevin Bacon Canadian to the Trump administration, right? He's a friend of J.D. Vance.
No, that's Jamil Javani.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
okay.
Different guy. But Shuv has the claim to fame to have spent a few months living at the Teneycke family farm back when I was running for a nomination in the riding of Blackstrap, unsuccessfully. It's like one of those things where the most important defeat I've had.
You're not tough enough. Politics. You're not tough enough for a place called Blackstrap. Blackstrap, you got to be a shit kicker, nail eating son of a bitch. You can't. Blackstrap, come on, man.
Yeah,
Blackstrap is Saskatchewan's ski hill. Blackstrap is a hill that was made for the 1970 Canada Winter Games by Ross Thatcher, and it is a hill made literally out of garbage. They hauled garbage there and piled it up, and then they put dirt over it, and it's called Mount Blackstrap. To you,
right. There we are. Well, it just sounds tough. That's all.
Some people call it the pimple of the prairies.
It kind of looks like that, but that riding is also, most of the population is actually southeast Saskatoon. But in fact, I think the riding doesn't exist in that form anymore. But one of the weird things about the political map in Saskatchewan, I think it was redrawn under you guys actually, but kind of like wagon wheels with a chunk of urban and then a bunch of rural. And
telling me.
Anyway, it's surprising that the Liberals redrew the map that way, because it certainly helped the seat count for Conservatives in the province.
Yeah, I can't remember the genesis for that, but it's a terrible map for Liberals. Well, you know what? All maps are terrible maps for Liberals right now. There is no, good map for Liberals. And on that note, let's get into it. So, rather than go through a turgid examination of everything that anybody who's interested in this has read already, let's just start with some sort of short, snappy reflections on things. Scott, what part of the result most surprised you?
What most surprised me? What most surprised me was me. What most surprised me and disappointed me in the result, as disappointing as I personally found it, was me and my stupidity and my absurd refusal to acknowledge the obvious in the days running up to the election. Because when you look at all the data, and I know people are poring over this, and they're saying, look at the way that the Hispanic map has redrawn itself in critical parts of the country, and Trump has drawn those voters, or how he's now getting 1/4 of black men. That's a scary and different development. All those things, and all those things are true, and the decisions her campaign made and didn't make. But the reason I'm so angry with myself and so surprised at how stupid I am is that 70% of Americans felt that the country was headed in the wrong direction. And I don't know what I'm doing, talking on a podcast or a television show or a radio show or in the corner bar, a coffee shop, or alone by myself in a closet about politics, if I don't fucking know that when 70% of voters feel that things are headed in the wrong direction, that it's a change election and whoever is the incumbent or incumbent adjacent is going to get defeated. And yet, I found myself willing to find all sorts of careful constructions that would allow me to assume that somehow Trump would be defeated, that Trump has a low ceiling, that, Wisconsin couldn't possibly go that way this time, that they had a bigger ground, all this fucking bullshit that I convinced myself of. And I'm so mad at myself. I'm so upset with myself because, there's so many profound things to take away from this election, and we're going to be confronted with such profound challenges, I think, going forward. I truly am distressed by it. But as a pundit, as a hack, I'm so mad at myself.
So what was your blind spot?
Well, I think my blind spot was bias, that I didn't want to believe that Trump would be reelected. I think that I did believe in particular the low ceiling. Like I think I had subscribed to conventional wisdom, which was that this was a man who could never win the popular vote, that he needed the dime to land on his side in order to win an election. And I thought, and this is always dangerous, and this is the applicability to Canada, I thought that there were special circumstances, that this could happen, that could happen. And you know what special circumstances die in front of? They die in front of an overwhelming demand for change. They die in front of an overwhelming consensus that the country is headed in the wrong direction. Those are numbers that defeat incumbents. And I really think the Prime Minister, and I know that a lot of liberals are thinking, wow, the contrast with Trump is going to be so explicit and we're going to be able to demonstrate our competence in managing it. That's all bullshit, man. Like, some of those things may be true, but what is most true is that 25% of Canadians think the country is headed in the right direction. The Prime Minister has become a lightning rod for discontent. And this is headed for a disastrous place electorally for the Liberal Party of Canada. And Tuesday night of last week was a reminder, not of bilateral relations and this or that. It's a reminder that change will not be denied, and it ain't going to be denied in Canada. And that should really tell the Prime Minister something really, 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 really significant.
All right, cool. Jordan, what's your biggest surprise out of the U.S. result?
Well, I think maybe not dissimilar to Scott. I don't know. We missed so many fundamentals that were not right with the Democratic campaign. And I think that's a lot of food for thought. I think we overweighed technical aspects of the Trump campaign that would appear to be basic campaign competence that he was not engaging in. And I think that I, for one, put too much stock in those things, like get at the vote operations and things like that in the end just didn't compare to incumbency, to her inability to break away from Biden, her inability to put forward a consistent economic message over the course of the campaign that connected with working class voters. And I think what probably surprised me the most is that we really saw in a in such a clear way, building on what happened with the non-white vote in 2020, we saw a real fracturing of the working class vote. We saw now that there is really it blows up the idea that there's this trade-off that you can maybe lose if you're a Democrat. You can lose some white working class voters, but you'll retain non-white and Hispanic working class voters around more identity-based issues, around perhaps a different way of talking about immigration. Like, I think it has blown that notion out of the water that had underpinned a lot of what the Democrats were sort of thinking about and how they were weighing how these things would go. I think that the really big takeaway, of course, as so many people have said, is that, yes, it's the economy, stupid. We should all have it tattooed somewhere. But it wasn't enough for them to hold Trump to account. It wasn't enough. Like, there was no vote coalition there that was viable for the Democrats around opposing Trump. And I think I was also surprised because going into the midterms in 2022, I was really skeptical about the idea that Dobbs and abortion could be enough of a galvanizing factor that it would carry the Democrats through. But it did, and they overperformed. And I think that I took that lesson too hard for this campaign, and it really did not do what they thought it was going to do for them in a huge way. So those were some of the elements that really stuck out to me.
So can I pick up with you right there? Because I guess my biggest surprise out of the result is the turnout among women, which we were sort of set up for a tsunami of female voters. And I guess in part we were sort of deceived by the Iowa poll, but there was also all the hype that was coming out of the Harris campaign and the way they were framing the last week of the campaign and all that, which clearly indicated that they both needed and expected that to happen. Why do you think it didn't?
I think it was hard to muster enthusiasm around an incumbent that people did not feel was responding to their household level economic concerns. And I think that a lot of it came down to that. I also think that if you look back over the trajectory of the Harris campaign, there was such a shift for them. Like, they started out that campaign, if you think back to kind of August, September, where, she had her bounce, coming out of convention. They were putting forward more of an economic message there. And then after the debates, that all sort of folded. And they went back to democracy, abortion, and then they started to do something that they had really consciously avoided, which in that last week, which was sort of talking about the historic nature of her candidacy and the historic nature of her win. And actually, that's how I would read some of the way they were talking about mobilizing particularly young women voters. It was another way to talk about sort of the historic nature of her potential victory. And I think it just didn't resonate with people. They did not feel that was what was uppermost in their mind. They were waiting to pass judgment on a government that they felt had not responded to their economic concerns.
Yeah. Okay. Kory, what was your big surprise? I know that you weren't surprised by the outcome.
Yeah, well, I think we talked about it, and I think it more or less landed, where I thought it would. But I think where people get hung up is thinking that because of some of the things that Trump has said and done, that and the sort of repugnant nature of some of his character flaws, which are can be pretty jarring, that somehow that would be the most important thing for voters, and it clearly wasn't. For the reasons that Scott and Jordan have laid out. At the end of the day, if you're somebody who is concerned about the state of democracy, and that is the most important thing that you have on your agenda and on your mind, I'll tell you a few other things about you. You're wealthy. You're very well educated. You're living a very comfortable life because you're dancing on the very peak of the mountain of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think what's the reality, and you could say the same thing about the electorate in Canada right now, is there are a lot of people who are not experiencing economic success, whose lives have gotten demonstrably worse, and not just in the last 4 years, in the last 30 years. Right, the move towards globalization has not worked out well for large swaths of the United States. And the interests of those people have really been forgotten by the political class in both parties for a long time. And Trump is as much an damning indictment of the Republican establishment as his victory over the Democrats is an indictment of theirs. Like, this is a sort of a revolt of the working class in a way that transcends race and ethnicity. And as people are saying, like, you know what, don't stop telling me the economy is good. Economy's not good for me, right? So, like, I think, the lessons are pretty clear. Much has been said in other ways about, the focus on identity politics generally, and the sort of woke agenda, all of that. And I think there's some truth to those things, but I think it's something much deeper and more profound about how the economy has been serving that cohort of workers. And, I think, they're mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore, is I think what you can take from that election. But I think not just that election, like the entire Trump phenomenon, I think is an embodiment of it.
Okay, I want to harken back a couple of decades to a less gray version of Herle, one who aspired to having actual biceps. When I was in the thick of government, there was nothing more satisfying than when new policy started to work the way it was supposed to fix what was clearly a problem. We've been talking here for the last few weeks about the rise of copper theft in Canada and the havoc it wreaks on our communities and public safety. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, believes industry and all levels of government must collaborate to address it. On the provider side, there's new early warning surveillance technology and other enhanced security measures they're investing in. But on the government side, let me be blunt. We need stricter penalties for thieves, some actual deterrence, new policy. The best practice examples are out there. Copper theft was costing the British economy an average of £1 billion a year. In 2012, British Transport Police launched Operation Tornado to trace sellers of scrap metal and make it infinitely more difficult to pass on illegally obtained copper and other metals, and punish those who try. In 1 year, a 51% drop in the crime. The UK also requires everyone who sells scrap metal to show proof of identity. Many of our provinces have also implemented this, but not all. It would also help if all provinces followed the lead of New Brunswick and Alberta, banning cash-in-hand payments for copper cable and scrap metal. Untraceable crime is successful crime. Finally, provincial scrap and metal dealer regulations need to be updated. Thieves are getting creative. We need to cut their source of resale. Updating these regulations will help do just that. Hurly-burlyites, I feel I'm on pretty solid ground when I say nobody wants to put up with essential service outages because thieves are cutting copper wire. It's a problem industry and policy can fix, and we should do it.
Hey, Dave, can I add one more quick thing? Because it runs off the democracy point, which is, and this sort of shakes me in terms of, well, how am I going to approach, political analysis going forward? Because one of the things I always watch for as someone who's trying to figure out what's going on out there is what are campaigns doing? And then making what I think are reasonably informed inferences from that based on campaign experience. So, for example, to Kory's point, the last 2 weeks of the campaign, there's no question that the Democrats and Kamala Harris personally in her campaign appearances abandoned the economic opportunity as a theme, and they went straight at this democracy issue, right? Democracy at risk. This is an aberrant person. His presidency will be twice as perverse as it was the first time around, all of which may be true, but all of which puzzled me at the time as they started doing that. But it gave me hope, oddly enough, because I watched them doing it and I thought, this seems counterintuitive to me. This doesn't seem like it ought to be the closing argument. But since it is, they must know something I don't. They must have access to data that tells them that this will shift 5 to 7% of voters, and that they can claim some voters. And they combined with the pulling power of Dobbs, which didn't show as potently as we thought, that could give them the advantage. And that was all wrong. Like, that was a strategic, obviously they were just wrong, and they didn't have that data or they misinterpreted it.
Wait a second. I think you and I have been in a couple of no-win situations before, right? And that may have been where they were. Like, I'm a little
Kobayashi Marus, yes.
Yeah,
indeed.
I'm a little reluctant to second guess them because I believe that the people running the Harris campaign are some of the best professionals in politics. And they had all the data at their disposal. And I presume that they were making decisions that were the best decisions they could make at the time. And so if they went that way and it didn't work, then akin to your long ago remark about Del Duca's vests, I guess the other things were worse.
Right.
Right?
Like to that point, like, you can only do so much with.
We'll just assume people know what that means.
In a certain situation.
Yeah.
Like, had Biden left, or said he was going to leave after the midterm elections and signaled that there was going to be an open nomination race, I think that the Democrats might have had a prayer. But I'm not sure it would have ultimately changed the outcome because I don't think the Democratic Party has absorbed any of the lessons that we just talked about in a fundamental way. I think I think David Axelrod used a line the other day that I thought was bang on. The Democratic Party says they're a party of the working class, and they treat workers in the working class, like to speak to them as missionaries would, villagers looking for a well in some impoverished corner of the world, right? Like they talk down to them. It's condescending. It's patronizing. It's shitty. I'm not sure they would have found a candidate that isn't like that. I think there are corners of the Democratic Party that get it on some of these things, but it's Bernie Sanders. It's not anyone in the Democratic establishment.
Yeah, and I think that speaks also to a couple other points that maybe build a little bit on what David and Kory were saying, is that when voters are feeling abandoned by, let's call it kind of the neoliberal status quo, and you're going out and you're really framing your argument around a defense of democracy, like you are de facto defending that status quo that people are feeling so very angry and left behind by. So even if they felt that there was some juice to squeeze out of there as a closing argument, it also reinforced some of the biggest vulnerabilities of their campaign. And I think that was probably insurmountable. But the timing for Biden waiting too long was absolutely, I think, in retrospect, saying the choice not to have an open primary, also, I think, in retrospect, clearly wrong. And those are things that you would need a time machine to fix. So I think, I agree that, for the closing argument for that campaign, I'm sure they did the best they could with the information they had, but I think it was baked at that point now when you really look back at some of those fundamentals.
The Liberal Party of Canada has a time machine because we're still living in the past, right? That's the thing like we're living unlike the Democrats prior to Election Day. So we can still alter the course of history yet to come.
The grim logic of some of the spin that's come out of the Liberals around this. Those who are saying,
let's hold on. We'll get to that. We'll get to that in Kyla's piece. I'm interested from all four of you, if there is a lesson from this campaign that you will apply the next time you are running or analyzing an election campaign.
I think the importance of ads and is, can't be understated in this. For all of the lack of message discipline from the candidate Trump, I think they ran an insanely disciplined and conventional campaign about Harris on some issues, and even though Harris outspent, I think if you go through the list of ads, and I think we'll probably talk about some of them, the most effective advertising was coming from Trump, and it was on the issues that we've talked about already. But I think advertising played a big and important role.
Massive, and it was the message discipline of the campaign. Trump was just off there in the ether, but they were pounding away with that ad where she says, "I can't think of anything I would do differently than Biden." They're pounding away on that ad where she's talking about how inmates deserve free transgender surgery. And it was there all the time. My lesson,
they them. and he's for you, right? Like that line, it's not about the trans issue. It's about who you're voting for, like who the candidate's working for. It's about identifying with part of the electorate, and it's not even an issue. Right.
I think my lesson, because we talked about it in the pod before, is how little GOTV matters, to be honest. And I think campaigns overspend on it. I think they over-resource it. Trump really didn't have anything remotely compared to what the Democrats had in terms of a GOTV operation, but he had something better. He had enthusiasm among his voters. He had motivated voters. And if you have motivated voters, you don't need people calling and offering babysitters. They'll find a way to get there. And so I think that's something that people always look at and they say, oh my God, well, this other party has a better organization. This other party has more on-the-ground resources. They'll overcome something. You're not overcoming anything with a GOTV operation.
I don't know whether I'd agree with you on that, David. Like, if you look at the states where they really spend a lot of time on their ground game, like, I think Pennsylvania would not have been anywhere near as close as it was if it wasn't for their ground game.
The Democratic ground game, you mean?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's probably a point or a point and a half, but I think that's what that, moves. In like really close races, it can make a difference. Like if it's focused on key areas, but I think David Eby's still premier because of ground game. Like I think there were more conservative voters out there in the province, and they were able to kind of limp across the finish line in some key ridings. But like I do agree with you. It's overstated its impact. But like there is an impact, and but it's like, what does that impact look like? It's a point and a half, maybe 2 points, but like it's not more than that.
By the way, Eby's win looks more impressive in retrospect than it did at the day it happened. Now that we've seen the other provinces in the American election, he pulled something out.
As did Scott Moe. Like it's a challenging environment for incumbents.
Yeah. So, in case you haven't noticed, seaports on the West Coast are shut down. Basically, dock workers issued a strike notice and management locked them out. The Port of Montreal, meanwhile, is effectively operating at half capacity. Weeks of rotating strikes and labor action have disrupted critical cargo shipments into and out of Eastern Canada. All this amounts to a garrote applied to the neck of the Canadian economy, one that is tightened with every day that passes. Nearly $1 billion worth of goods is affected daily. Soon enough, mountains of backlogged sea containers will begin to stack up. For the moment, Canadians might not be noticing the knock-on effect, but it is happening. This will cost money, and guess who will pay the bill? It should be no surprise that our sponsor, CN, is a big stakeholder in all this. CN trains cannot, for example, deliver and offload products to ships in Vancouver or Prince Rupert, or accept incoming cargo. CN's intermodal terminals cannot accept cargo destined for the Port of Montreal or BC ports. And soon enough, thousands of Canadian businesses and their employees will feel the burn. This is not opinion, it is fact. If this situation continues, it will lead to mill shutdowns, furloughs, and higher prices to consumers. The domino effect will spread through the economy. We really don't need this. It's an own goal. CN believes we need to rethink the labor management ecosystem within our supply chains. And meanwhile, get back to the bargaining table. There's nothing more durable than a negotiated settlement, and let's face it, that's the usual outcome. The only question is how long the game of chicken should be allowed to go on. Scott, you got a lesson that you've learned, other than not to trust your own instincts?
Well, I mean, that's just so ridiculous. I mean, everybody else learned that lesson so long ago. I think one lesson that exceeds this electoral cycle and exceeds just the pure fact of change, and don't ignore, the hard gravel of change when that's what you're walking on in bare feet, is don't sound like a politician. Like I think for a decade now, roughly, whatever it's been, 8 years, we've had Donald Trump 9 years. And I'll never forget this lesson that I learned when he first was on the scene. Remember back in the early days of the Republican primary when they had like 15, 16, 17 candidates, and they had them on one of those debates. They had them up on a stage, and those debates were being televised. And I remember I came home, and my two oldest sons were laying on the couch. I came home late. It was like 10 o'clock at night, and they were watching the GOP debate. And they were like, you've got to watch this, Dad. Their old man has worked in politics his whole life. They never showed any interest in politics. And now they're not watching a show. They're watching the GOP debate. And they're like, this fucking guy doesn't sound like anything you've ever heard in your life. And that's one of the most insightful observations I've ever taken away. Trump doesn't sound like a politician. He is, as you know, Ezra Klein points out, disinhibited. But it's not just what he's willing to say. It's how he says it, how different he sounds. Not every politician can do it. But boy, Kamala Harris sure sounded like a politician when she spoke, right? Justin Trudeau, for all his talent, and I think he's wildly talented as a political leader, he sounds like a politician, to be fair.
Well, it's the filters. What you're talking about, Scott, are the filters. So a politician gets asked a question, and they immediately run an algorithm of 3,700 potential answers through 35 filters of what will result from any given word in that answer and spew something banal and safe.
Yes. But there's what and there's how. I really want to point, because frankly, the point I'm making, if we want to be honest, Pierre Poilievre sounds like a politician. He fucking for sure sounds like a politician. Now, what he's saying, he's trying to sound less filtered and more like the crowd that he's talking to. But the truth of the matter is that most politicians... Most politicians are politicians, and most politicians sound like politicians. So when it comes to campaigns, and when it comes to watching campaigns, what's a big thing that I'm thinking about these days is who sounds different, who has the voice, who has an ear for the voice of regular working folk who lace their boots up. And because if you have that going for you, doesn't mean you're going to win. But boy, are you ever down the road and over the hill compared to everybody else? Because we are such a practiced, technocratic place when it comes to campaigns, and people that don't sound like a politician, I think, have a real advantage. And Trump, for all his ills and evils, of which there are many, has never sounded like a politician. I think it's been a huge, huge power and advantage.
Well, if that's the frame talking about this, and I would say also the same about finding candidates that can communicate with the types of voters that we're talking about, more working class folks, people who've been left behind in one way or another by the economy we have. Boy, oh boy, does that make you think Mark Carney would be a huge mistake. A huge, huge mistake. Wrong type of person, all of the things you just talked about in spades. But, there's a challenge in trying to find people who have that air of authenticity and have some sort of connection point to voters, especially those who are feeling very alienated from the economy that exists today. And
that's why Mark needs to do 100 fundraisers and coffees and just
all black
talk to regular folk.
Well, he'll be
seriously
talking like people like me, but not like. There's no common touch that's obvious there. And I'd say it's the same problem that I think Singh's challenged with. It's hard to connect with people who, as Axelrod was saying, that treat those voters speak to them like a missionary in a foreign land. You got to have some connection to folks. And if we want to talk about what I think is the secret of Ford's success, I think that's a big part of it.
All right. Jordan, what's your lesson?
Yeah, I think relentless focus on household level economic issues is what needs to happen for parties right now if they want to break through. And I think, what's particularly kind of incredible if you look back at Biden's record, they had a really huge sort of left swing in their economic policy, the Inflation Reduction Act. This stuff is huge. His participation with labor unions, walking a picket line. They did a lot of those things, but they lost focus on it during the campaign. They weren't able to punch through with a household level economic message that was big enough for people to notice it and to feel reflected in it. And I think, as others have said, and this goes to a little a bit what Kory was saying, the authenticity with which the principal is communicating that economic message is so important for people to hear it. There has to be some sense that there's like a real authentic connection to that concern to actually make that contact with people. But you can't lose focus on that as an issue. And I think this is something we've talked about also with respect to provincial campaigns. So that's about like the new policy rollout during a campaign is not 30 different announcements. It's the economy at a household level, 30 different ways in order to actually make that connection on that issue. And I really think that this is about discipline and focus before the writ period as well.
Okay, but Jordan, let's just take a second and examine why that isn't the case. I mean, it's not like people don't know these things. I mean, James Carville, A, is not a unique genius, and The Economy Stupid was 1992, right? Long time ago. And I presume that when FDR was running against Herbert Hoover, he said, I should focus on the economy. So I don't think it's a new idea. So what are the things that prevent a party like the Democratic Party from doing that? What forces them to imbue their message with a bunch of other shit that isn't that relevant? And it has a lot to do with the party itself.
Yes, absolutely.
I remember having Michael Balagas on the Herle Burley and talking about this in the context of new Democratic Party campaigns and their platforms. And him telling me, I don't have the freedom to design the electorally perfect platform because there's too many interests that have to be accommodated, right? And too many icons that have to be nodded to in our platform and in our messaging, or the party won't stand for it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that it's about the type of vote coalition that people within the core of that campaign believe that they're bringing together versus the type of vote coalition that they would actually need in order to make breakthroughs. And these are increasingly, I think those are two different things. And to speak to that, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. The Democrats did have an economic message early in this campaign, but they got pulled off of it. We don't know internally why, but they did. They got pulled off of it. They got pulled off into Haitians and, what was happening in Springfield after the debate. They got pulled off into January 6th.
You should be outraged by what this comic said about Puerto Rico.
That's right. And they moved away from that proactive message about the type of future that they would be offering to working class voters in America. And instead, we're leaning more heavily on an anti-Trump coalition and that was just not enough. And so even though I would make the case that actually, Biden's record is pretty good on this stuff, and the Harris campaign actually had some good pieces. They had some good pieces around the child tax benefit, the home purchasing stuff, but they left all of that aside as they made their closing argument to voters. And so that discipline actually wasn't there. It did not hold all the way through the campaign. And whether that was due to something they were seeing internally in their polling, or I think more probably due to some factors within their own coalition, at the end of the day, the result was the same. Voters did not hear that there was any change there for them on the issue that was most important to them.
But they don't want change. They don't embody change. Like, for a party that is so dominates like the intelligentsia and the well-educated and the wealthy, they sure are fucking stupid at the end of the day when it comes to actually understanding what is driving the electorate. And they just don't, I think they have trouble with that message because they don't experience it. They don't feel it. Like, there's no economic hardship there. They do look down their nose at most of the working class. And they want to, change them into having, they want to have them think this the way that they do, right? So hence the joke, hence identity politics, hence the whole game of words like how you describe people, how you describe things. Like there's a whole lexicon around all that, which is very exclusionary. It's very condescending, and it's very unrelated to any problem that any real person has in the economy and in their life today. And so if you're just gonna talk to yourself, if your audience is your friends as opposed to the broader electorate, good luck. Good luck.
No. I agree with that. I don't quarrel with that. The only thing I would say is that doesn't completely explain the circumstance we find ourselves in today, because obviously Trump doesn't have the lived experience of pain and economic discomfort.
Speak to it.
But he can.
Right?
That's
you
what
don't, you don't have to be of it. You don't have to be of it. You have to speak to it. Right?
So that's what's so important, right?
I don't think
liberals,
people thinks he understands their lives, but I think people thinks he's going to break some shit.
Yeah, he's an
That's
artist.
right.
He's going to blow up the system that people feel is unjust. That's it.
No, so let me heard a lot of people say things like, "I've been voting for politicians my entire life, and guess what that's done for me? Nothing. So I'm going to vote for this guy who's going to take a wrecking ball to the establishment, because what have I got to lose?"
Yeah, the type of change that he's bringing is less important than the fact that he's bringing a large scale of change.
Let me just make two specific recommendations for would-be politicians, particularly of the middle, right, of the Democrats, liberals / NDP, because I think that we are particularly prone to some of the ills that Kory suggests. And it isn't just about dropping your R's or rolling your R's, dropping your G's, saying fuck every now and then, right? Like, I think there's, it's two specific things. One, so often liberals, Democrats, new Democrats, they mistake policy for message. So they're looking at the data that you're talking about, Kory, and they are understanding it. And they recognize that people are looking for someone to fight for them and to look for a step up. And so then they put together something like a lunch program. But they don't talk about it in a way that persuades anybody who's in a position to receive that program as though it's going to benefit them and their kids. They talk that, so policy isn't message. And the second thing is, what is your starting point? So often, particularly incumbents, begin with what they aspire to do rather than the fucking thing I'm going to fix. Right? And it's a really simple point about communication. Do you start with a problem or do you start with a solution? Liberals in particular, I'll just speak for my own party, love to start with, here's our new program. Let me tell you about pharmacare, blah, 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 blah. As opposed to starting with, and therefore getting people on your side, starting with, you can't get fucking you can't get drugs at a decent cost.
The lack of universality and all of these things that you're talking about too, I think is another big thing that's harmful and erodes the efficacy and the unifying nature that those programs might have if they were universal, gets eroded away. So, even when there is a pharmacare program or there is a lunch program or there is a this or that, it's like, well,
but you're talking policy.
There are a whole lot of people who are left out, because even when you do something like that, it's for only certain people, only in certain regions. So, I'll understand you have affordability issues around home heating, but we're going to do something only for people in Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but Kory, I'm saying something more elemental. Like, if you're a political leader, right, you can start with, here's my home heating oil rebate. Or you can start with the fucking price of home heating is too high. And so often incumbents, so often liberals, so often people are in government and they're talking about these things around boardroom tables before they take them out to the local legion. They talk about it in terms of that policy remedy. So before I even get to hear about the pharmacare program, whether or not it's universal, right, I want to tell people what they are thinking already. I want to connect with them by getting their heads nodding around the fact that, yeah, man, like, Jesus Christ, how about the price of this fucking diabetes medicine I got to pay for each month? Then your solution sounds like it connects with something. And I just find it over and over and over again, I run into this with liberal politicians. And it's exacerbated by being in government, because they don't want to talk about a problem, because that means that they must have failed to address something.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, the idea that if the sentence coming out of your mouth is something that involves the GDP per capita as any measure of people's lived experience, like, you're fucked. That is just not useful. And beyond that frame as a way to explain the benefits of what your governing record is to people is actively reinforcing some of the most harmful aspects of defending a status quo that people feel is not working for them.
So here's something. In 1992, Bill Clinton ran against NAFTA. And Bill Clinton said he would change NAFTA. And he didn't. And he got famous for going around to union halls and telling them that there was a new economy that they had to get part of. Barack Obama ran against NAFTA. Didn't touch it. Hillary Clinton ran against NAFTA. And Trump overtly says, I'm going to raise tariffs. And the Democrats tell everybody how stupid he is because he doesn't understand how tariffs work and how expensive they are. So basically, Americans have never liked NAFTA. They've been looking for somebody to blow it up. They've been voting for people who promised to blow it up for decades. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats talked it to get the votes and didn't do it for whatever reasons we can speculate. And now Trump is just actually responding to a demand that's been there for decades, which is protect us against these cheap jobs.
Well, I think on that, NAFTA is going to be dead. But I don't think that necessarily means a free trade deal with Canada is dead. But I think the problematic part for the American economy and Americans and what they're actually complaining about is the Ross Perot's giant sucking sound of manufacturing jobs going to low wage markets, be them in China or be them in Mexico, and they're fucking done with it.
But David, you're so dumb. God, man, you missed the point. Who has been talking about friendshoring and the response on a multilateral basis, to geopolitical pressures for 2 years? So, friendshoring is staring you in the face. So, that's it's a good example of the point I'm trying to make, right? Before I try to get heads nodding at the Foreign Relations Council and have everybody applaud my speech by me talking about friendshoring, just go out and go, hey, you know what? The structures we have, these deals, they're fucking us. And then people will nod their head. And then they might listen to you. But we start at the wrong end of the fucking telescope every time.
Well, they don't think that they are is the problem, right?
This is part of defending
the problem.
Economic consensus that's not working for regular people.
All right, let's get to our clipping. 4 Lessons for Canadian Progressives by Kyla Rennell and Fitch. Running an unpopular leader is a betrayal of your party and the voters you're trying to fight for. That's lesson 1. Running an unpopular leader is a betrayal of your party and the voters you're trying to fight for. Joe Biden rescued the Democratic Party in 2020 and crippled it in 2024. As the candidate, his job is to win. It was clear well before this summer he was not the Democrats' strongest bet. He was probably the weakest. His resolve to stay cost the party months of critical organizing. Lesson 2. Voters think the economy is fucked. We need to learn how to talk about it. Progressives need to stop treating the economy like a side dish. For most voters, it's the entire meal. More than just the degree of focus it receives, the economy needs to be discussed in a way that means something to voters. Enough with uber consultified opportunity economy type language. Lesson 3, we can't give up on men. One thing that still needs to be quantified is exactly how big the gender divide was in this election. In polls, I've seen anywhere from 15 to 20 points, and it was clear from the Harris campaign's final messaging that they were going all in on women. In my last newsletter, I showed that young men plan to come out for Poilievre in astronomical numbers. We can't win with these margins. Progressives need to figure out how to appeal to men. And lesson 4, there are no shortcuts. Poilievre is not Trump. Canada is not the US. We'll need to write our own story. I can imagine some Canadian progressives feeling a twisted bit of relief. Well, at least now we can run against Trump. For that to work, Poilievre and Trump would need to be viewed as similar. The work hasn't been done to create that connection. In my September poll, I found that 20% of Canadians think Poilievre and Trump are extremely similar, 23% think they are somewhat similar, and 39% think they're either somewhat or totally different, 17% aren't sure. Even among NDP and Liberal voters, just half think Trump and Poilievre are similar. Okay, so I don't really identify as a progressive. Jordan, I identify as a Liberal.
Maybe that's your problem, David.
Maybe you fully embrace the progressive label. So why don't you start with a reaction to what Kyla's written here?
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of the points. And I think in particular, going back to what I was saying earlier, the spin that has been coming out, particularly from some folks in the Liberal camp, about the notion that Trump's reelection makes it more sensical to keep Trudeau for sort of 3 reasons, right? So they say, well, we have the record, we can take on Trump. Great. Number two, well, look at the Democrats. They got rid of Biden and it didn't help them. Okay. That one is probably the grimmest of them all.
Unbelievable. If we get to within 1.5 percentage points, holy Christ.
Right? And the third, which is exactly what Kyla was talking about, the notion that they can run against Poilievre as a Trump. These are all demonstrably false. And I think the idea that you are going to be able to bank on a record. So again, going back to what we were just talking about, if people view the free trade agreements and the economic situation that they have set up for households as fundamentally failing them in their lived day-to-day lives, and your argument is that, well, we were successful in baking that in last time, let us do it again, like that, it is not a winner. That is not a winner right now. And I think on a practical level, we're also facing a different Trump. This is a Trump who is not surrounded by the same people that he was surrounded by last time, who has made a lot more specific commitments around trade. And I think we're also in a time, of course, of growing protectionism, even I would call progressive protectionism, right? So there's for true centrists, I think there's a really unappealing island left for them politically on this. And that is exactly where the Liberals are in the process of stranding themselves. The idea that for the Democrats, changing from Biden to Harris, well, okay, they still lost. Like, if that's your argument for keeping Trudeau, then this is well and truly the most defeatist, but I have heard that one.
Have you seen, by the way, have you seen the internals, the Biden internals? So John Favreau on his podcast was revealing that when the Harris people took over, they finally got access to Biden's polls, and it showed Trump winning 400 electoral votes.
Jesus. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, yeah.
Right.
So,
like who was talking to him? Like who was talking to Biden? Like maybe this is like the true crime in all of this is the role of advisors and enablers and you know, allowing these delusions on the part of their candidate to persist. Yeah. Like, do you think anyone is actually sitting Trudeau down and showing him the actual numbers? Like how broad and deep this slaughter is going to be?
Yeah. Can I finish one more point? So
on that totally can. Sorry, I just wanted to get your point. I know, with
yeah, because that's bad. But look, so the idea that you can run against Poilievre because he's going to be a mini Trump and we can make that case. Well, number one, no one has made that case. Number two, there's actually a lot of evidence that suggests that Canadians believe that Poilievre would be better at standing up to Trump. So strong possibility. That's right. An asshole for an asshole, right? Like there's a strong possibility that backfires. And then I think worst of all is that doesn't take into account the idea that Trump is actually probably going to make Poilievre look pretty sane in comparison. So making that argument, I actually think gets more difficult, not easier over time as we see more of Trump, as we see more of these decisions. So I think that those, I would add those maybe to what Kyla is talking about there, because there is no good news for the Liberals in this. And as for progressives, yes, we cannot, as a movement, and I say this for Liberals, as New Democrats, there needs to be a concerted effort to think about how to regain men, how to regain young men who by other measures are far more progressive than previous generations of men. They are gettable for us, but not in the way that we are currently doing politics.
So, Scott, how does Canada's first feminist government reach out to men?
Well, I'm not sure this government constructed with this leadership can. I don't know that there will be any. I don't know that there's a prospect for hope on that front. I think you would have to have change in order to give yourself a crack at it, which is so much the fundamental underlying point that Kyla is making here, right? Like and I'm not one of these people that's a cross-eyed, lunatic, anti-Trudeau guy. Like I hate every time I post something on this topic, my feed gets jammed with all these right-wing, like, gun lover 69 or something. I'm not with those people, right? I want the Liberal Party to be strong. I want it to be competitive in the next election. If it has to lose, I want it to lose by less, not more. And I definitely don't want it to be devastated. And so when I look at Kyla's piece, to me, I felt like she's Morpheus, and she's saying there's a red pill and there's a blue pill. Okay. Do you guys want to continue to chew on the blue pill and pretend the Trump selection is a good thing for you? See the silver lining in every single event, even though you're actually chained to the wall in wrought iron? Or do you want to take the red pill and lift your eyes to reality and say, all right, what could we possibly do about it? And I just think there's so many lessons there. And if you want to talk to young men, then I think change is going to be a prerequisite. I think you're going to have to change who's talking and how they're talking. And I think you're also going to need to change, some of your fundamental policy offerings. I don't think that we can continue to, and Kory makes this point every fucking time we're on TV, radio, this podcast, sitting in a bar, on a streetcar, like Kory will go, April 1st, the carbon tax goes up, and it's just this absolute meteor screaming toward our dinosaur planet. And so when I look at her piece, the most important thing from my perspective is start with the lesson the Biden rejected. And this is why I joke, we do have a time machine. And it started with, an unpopular leader is going to do you no favors. And I just think, I hope to goodness that the prime minister looks at these currents. He looks at the result last week. He looks at the numbers that have him where he is right now and says, it is not in my self-interest to end my political career like this. And it's definitely not in the interest of any of the institutions that I care desperately about to lead them to such a humbling and total end. So I hope that everybody in the PMO and around the Prime Minister is reading Kyla's piece, because I think it's really insightful, and I think it is a red pill must.
Right. Although they may or may not get past the first lesson, which is you have to replace the leader. But Kory, what do you think about this?
On the gender gap and appealing to men, in particular, I
no, about Kyla's piece overall.
Yeah, Kyla's piece overall. Look, I agree with all four of them. I thought, no surprise. I think she's one of the most thoughtful people out there in liberal polling world. Had a good mentor. I credit her, and also being from the blessed land of Saskatchewan doesn't hurt.
That's right.
But no, I think it's a very thoughtful piece, and I think it's pretty much bang on. And I think maybe she should change her name to Cassandra, because I don't think the truth of those words are going to be heeded. I think she's laying out what the future is going to be, and I don't think anybody is going to do anything different. To be honest, I will say a couple things on the you can't leave out young men, but I think this government has not only left out young men, I think they've gone to war on young men. If you want to look at who bears the brunt of the decision to bring in over 1 million temporary foreign workers and fake students, it's young men. So you look at where the unemployment is the highest. It's youth unemployment. You're really kicking the shit out of people in the bottom end of the labor force, which are young people, and a lot of them male, and you're especially hitting sort of physical labor and the working class with that. And I think they've just punished the hell out of them economically. You look at the decisions around not building any housing anywhere, all of the NIMBY stuff, which it afflicts everyone, but I think it is largely a creation of the left. And it's made housing unaffordable for these people. We're doing a whole lot of things to really, kick sand in their eyes economically. And if that's not enough, we'll just remind them at every given moment how they should feel guilty and be in a perpetual state of apology for something some previous generation or someone of the same ethnicity has done to someone else of a different ethnicity. It's a shitty, shitty narrative. And, so no wonder they don't want to vote for him. Why would you?
All right, Jordan, I got one last time. I'm coming back to you, and the other two guys can jump in on this, but I'm going to you specifically because you're not just a progressive, which is some phrase of some amorphous amalgam of NDP and liberal or whatever. You are a New Democrat, right? And these 4 lessons say that for the Liberal Party to win, they would have to be less progressive. They would have to get rid of Trudeau, who is the most progressive-oriented politician who's ever been the Prime Minister of Canada. They would have to stop talking about the climate and stop talking about identity politics and start focusing on working class economics. So there'd be a lot of pushback to that, wouldn't there? I mean, and in some extent, people are going to say to you, well, what are you winning for in that circumstance? If you're prepared to discard the environment and climate change from your discourse now, just because it's politically unpopular, what's the point of you?
I think we do no one any favors, and I will say this for progressives more broadly, although this, I think, applies particularly to New Democrats. We do no one any favors when we lose. And when we build our campaigns and we build our messages around things that don't resonate with people, that is what we're setting up to do. And so I think that what is really before us here is a choice. And it's asinine to say this, but really it's, have you tried economic populism? Because I don't think that necessarily moving more in that direction is not necessarily an unprogressive thing. In fact, I think that is a very progressive thing. But it's about what you're putting in the shop window. And if you're putting, as for example, this Liberal government has, if you're putting the carbon tax in the shop window, if you're putting the feminist foreign policy in the shop window, if that is what you are out there selling to people, then that's what they're going to hear. And I think that it's quite clear that right now, this is not the moment where that is what voters are interested in. So there is an opportunity here. And I would argue probably more so for New Democrats, for Social Democrats more broadly, who have a little bit more latitude to be economic populists in an authentic way, to be against some of these institutions that are fundamentally failing people. But they have to choose to take up that space with discipline within their own vote coalition. And that is going to mean saying no to some other things, to putting other things in the window. And that's going to mean really, really drilling down on having policies that are, yes, good and big enough to make a difference, but that are communicated in a way that actually is heard by voters, that is not condescending, that is reflective of their lived experience. And I really don't think that that has been on the table federally.
Okay, cool. All right, our last topic for today is courtesy of Mr. Teneycke has some thoughts on the state of political polling. Where'd you want to go here, Kory? What do you want to talk about?
Well, I think there's an example from the U.S. election, of course, that Iowa poll, which was wildly inaccurate and basically took over the airwaves for the last 4 or 5 days of the campaign, whatever it was. But like wildly off. But I would also say we've seen in a number of provincial elections, like the polling that came out in the Saskatchewan election, wildly off, right? Like when you look at what the graph looked like of polls reported, there's 2 that said it was going to be super duper close. And then what actually happened on election day was like what all the other polling had said for, the whole rest of the campaign and the months leading into it. So, rogue polls put out by companies that, really don't have a track record in polling. And, you would say in the case of Ontario, we've seen 4 by-elections in the last year. All 4 of them, bullshit IVR polls come out that are wildly off and are picked up by the media and reported. And if there's, one party that, should join forces with me on this, it'd be Jordan and the NDP, because in almost every case,
I have thoughts.
It states a collapse of the NDP vote, which is either overstated or not there at all, in order to try to create a stampede towards the Liberals. I think the media is complicit in this, because these polls themselves are nothing if not that augmented by the media, putting them out there, and not pressure testing, the underlying methodology. So, for instance, I would say IVR polls, shit, garbage. They're total garbage. And so, if somebody has an IVR poll, why are you publishing it? at all. And if you're a company like, say, Main Street, who mostly does IVR polls, what the fuck are you doing in the polling business? You're not in the polling business. You're in the bullshit business. So like, I think we got to get way better about having some level of accountability. I think the trade association that represents pollsters in the country, I think, is more concerned about preventing pollsters from talking shit about somebody's bad poll than they are about actually cracking down on bad polling. But like, I think
it's a business with no barrier to entry, Kory.
There's no, well, any jackass can call themselves a pollster. And, but that doesn't mean that everyone's the same, right? Like, this is actually a profession, and there are people who actually do a really good job of it. And there are limits to polling. Like, when you get into the margin of error, like, these aren't predictive to the final percentage point. But you know what they also aren't? They're not 18 points off, right? Like, no. But the IVR shit that we've seen of late is that off, and sometimes it's more off than that. So to all the journalists out there listening to this, do your fucking job and actually check on the methodology that people are using before you put something in on your station or in print. And for the polling association, crack down on the jokers who are doing this, because you're doing no service to anyone. None whatsoever.
So I have some thoughts on this myself, which is, first of all, Ann Seltzer in Iowa, I feel really badly for. She's had a career in which she's become known as an oracle of Iowa. She's always right, always understands it better than anybody else does, even in their crazy caucus system and managing that. She had the 19th time out of 20. She had the 20th time out of 20, sorry. I mean, the polls, they've always heard this your whole life. They're accurate to within X percentage points 19 times out of 20. There's a rogue. And anybody who's done tracking over the course of, say, 35 days of an election has seen that 20th one arrive. Usually causes a rush of shit to the heart that day when it happens. But so she got the 20th out of 20. She should have gone back into the field. With that remarkable a result, she should have gone, before she published, she should have gone right back in and seen if she could replicate that or not. So she made an error of judgment. I feel bad for her. But nonetheless, the polling did underestimate Trump again in a whole bunch of different places. And the polling in Saskatchewan underestimated the Sask party. And I'm starting to wonder if there's a rural issue. I'm starting to wonder if some of the techniques that pollsters are using don't work as well in rural areas.
Well, the techniques that might potentially work best, like random digit dialing, to actually, require people to pick up their phones. I think there's a whole host of reasons why a lot of the methodologies that are sort of the gold standard on this are becoming scarcer. They're far more expensive than things like IVR and online polling. And in Canada, of course, like, we also just have like an economics of scale issue. It's always going to be very expensive to get accurate polling in a provincial race, and there's not going to be that much of it, because to get that higher quality polling, you need to lay out that much more money. So you might only get one of those over the course of a given campaign. And so I actually think, in the case of Ann Seltzer, her methodology was good. Her methodology was very solid. I agree she probably should have gone back into the field, but that to me is in a very different category from the type of stuff that we see from Main Street, which is really low quality polling that's being taken at the same level of something that has a methodology that's a lot more proven. So I think that there's some maybe consumer education to be done within the media on this, because there are standards, there are things that work better, that are known to work better, and that's not often reflected in the coverage of these polls.
It's a symbiotic relationship with media, right? Because the media are desperate for polls as content, because they're not generating content of their own anymore. So this is like content that's given to them. But the second thing is it's free. They don't pay anything. So it's a complete loss leader for the polling organizations. And they're going to get, as Kory says, they're going to get printed whether they spent $25,000 collecting the data or $1,400 collecting the data. It's still going to get printed.
Well, especially if it's controversial and it's telling them what they want to hear, which is, often putting their thumb on a race.
Well, and it's not new, it's just badder. It's just worse. I mean, you would know better, David, having made this your profession over the years, but I'll never forget, 2010, 2012, something like that. going out for dinner with our friend Alan Gregg, one of the, maybe the most prominent pollster in Canadian history, along with guys like Marty Goldfarb. And I remember him saying,
one of the guys that motivated me to want to do this.
Yeah, and I remember having dinner and him saying, at some point in the last couple of years, I learned that people were no longer willing to pay me to be me. That polling had become so commoditized, not just in the media world, but even in terms of what corporate clients were willing to pay for. They'd be like, well, I could get a poll from you that's going to cost X. And I would say to them, and for that price, you're going to get sound methodology, careful analysis, years and years and years of experience and insight that will then be applied to the segmentation analysis that you will receive from me. Or we can pay Y, which is a fraction of all of that. And people go, well, I think I'll take Y. So I always remember when Alan said, nobody's paying me to be fucking Alan Gregg anymore. So I have to consult. Being a pure pollster is no longer something that I can do economically because the business becomes so commoditized. It's a real shame. And it's 10 times worse now in the media environment we exist.
Well, I think part of the reason why a lot of people won't pay the higher price is a lot of people ask for polls because they want to get a media hit. They don't actually want to know.
Right.
They don't want an accurate poll. They want an information point that they can put in the media that says what I want to do
is really popular.
Yeah, and they want politicians and others to see that, and they're quite uninterested in having any truth or accuracy in it. Like it's very short term thinking, but we've all encountered more than our share of clients that take that approach.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Pinsent, you have the time to wrap this up for us today.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Okay, who wants to go first with the Hey You?
Oh, I can go.
You go, Jordan.
It's just it's building on what I talked about a bit today, and it's going out to the federal NDP, to Jagmeet Singh, to the federal NDP caucus. Look, there's going to be a temptation to think that the U.S. results are mostly a wake-up call for the Liberals, but that would be wrong. This is a burning red, fucking molten core warning message for you as well. You cannot just oppose Pierre Poilievre and expect to get a windfall of anti-Poilievre votes when people desert the Liberals. You have to have a disciplined economic message that proposes something big enough that people notice, that connects with authenticity, and that resonates with working class voters. And to do that, you need some focus, you need some seriousness, and you need some energy to deliver that. And you need it right now. You cannot expect to spend the next 6 months diverted onto every other issue, whether that is cultural, identity, foreign policy, whatever it is. You can't expect to spend that time on those issues and then just pivot to these other economic issues during a campaign and have that resonate. And so that is going to mean saying no. That is going to mean choosing to be disciplined within your own caucus, within our own vote coalition. And that is really the only path forward. If you want to be ready to seize some of the electoral opportunity that's in front of you in the next campaign, people are weighing options right now about who they will or will not consider in the next election, and they may find you wanting in the current circumstance.
All right. Sober. Scott?
Well, my Hey You, I'll just harken back to where we started, given that uniquely our show drops here, our pod drops on Remembrance Day. So I'll just say this, and I'll connect oddly enough to the world of politics and government. I was never a soldier. I was never a, big military rah-rah guy, wasn't involved in Air Cadets or something like that. And so I didn't have that frame of reference, but I did have an Uncle Gord, an Uncle Tink, and a grandfather Jack who all went to war, all volunteered when they were 19. And, they went to war. It deeply affected them. A couple of them, it really darkly affected. And I don't know, when it came time to evaluate the question of going into Afghanistan, going to Kandahar, all those things, I'm not saying that it is gave me any unique insight. But given that I'd never been in the military, given that I didn't come from a background, just being able to think about them as we thought about that decision, that made me feel a little more strapped to the deck, a little more tied to the consequences and implications of those decisions. And so I'll just offer that. That's something I remember on Remembrance Day.
Yeah. All right. Kory?
Well, I just wanted to say a couple more words about Preston Manning. It was really a wonderful reminder at the end of the evening, hearing him speak for, 10 minutes or so about a range of things. What a thoughtful and man who's really dedicated his life to public service and being willing to, sort of step out of the way of in leadership to have other people, take the torch and move forward. And has been just incredibly supportive, both on the intellectual side of, bringing ideas forward, but also in terms of, helping and encouraging and advancing other people, and if it wasn't for Preston, I wouldn't have had the career I've had. And I got to say, every step along the way, he's been there to be encouraging, and I'm far from unique. He's done that for just hundreds of people out there. So, hey, Preston, you mean the world to me and to so many other people who you've touched through your work, and just a real honor to know you.
Yeah, very nice. Very nice. My hey you, well, first of all, I should just say to the Saskatchewan Roughriders, you got fucking spanked, right? And this is not a roster to run back next year, okay? Yeah, we're not competitive with Winnipeg, so like the Liberals, get that in your head. Not competitive. My real hey you goes out to Murray Sinclair, who died this past week, and the memorial service was on the weekend. I didn't know him. I never met him. But I have nothing but admiration for somebody who is able to go through life the way he went through it, as somebody that was expected to represent Indigenous people and all the hurt that they feel, as somebody who would have faced an incredible amount of racism himself, as somebody who sat there at the Truth and Reconciliation hearings and heard everybody's stories about the residential schools and what they went through, listened to their individual stories, to come through all that and have the generosity of spirit and the openness to reconciliation and the desire for reconciliation, as opposed to responding with anger, rage, desire for revenge. This guy was a builder, and in his own way did whatever he could to try to build this country and unify the country, and I have nothing but respect for that. So hey you, Murray Sinclair.
Here, here.
Great one.
Yeah, well said.
Okay. Well, that's our show for this week. I don't know if anybody gave a shit. We blathered on about American politics, and there's so much of that out there. But if you did stay to the end, you accursed, thanks for listening. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and these three who eventually show up every week and get together and shoot the shit. It was a lot of fun again today. Thanks a lot. We'll be back next week with more of it. In the meantime, take care of yourselves.